Okay. Well, we'll make a start. So thanks everybody for joining this afternoon. Looks like we've got a good turnout again today. So thanks all for joining. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Steve Bullough. So apologies, it wasn't Temis again. It's actually Steve this week. So apologies for my minor error sending out the information the first time round. So Steve's going to talk to us this afternoon about the development of homegrown players in European football leagues. So I'll hand over to Steve, and if everybody's able to mute their microphones as well, that'd be great. Thanks so much, guys.
So hopefully that's showing up on screen, Marcus, is that correct?
Yeah, that looks good to me, thanks.
Great, okay. Thanks, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks you for joining the session today. As Marcus said, my presentation's on player development in elite football, and the presentation's a mixture of findings taken from 4 different research papers we've had published in the last few years, which examine player development in European football. The research has a particular focus on the number of players and the volume of player experiences being created in different countries. The original study was focused on the impact of the Premier League, the creation of the Premier League had on developing English players. And that sample was developed in terms of the different countries that we're looking at and the different time frames. So it's extended into European football, and the data that we've used is from different points between the 1999-2000 season and the 2016-17 season, depending on which when each of the different publications was published. We are updating it at the moment. We've actually got one of our placement students at level 5 doing some work on that. So the more up-to-date data is on its way, but we still haven't quite got to that point yet. So I'm going to start the presentation just by briefly outlining the context and history, which has helped shape the environment in which professional football is currently operating in, before outlining the sample for the research in terms of the big 6 leagues that we were looking at. I'll then provide some of the headlines finding from across the different research papers, beginning with the results from the perspective of each of the national associations, so England, Spain, Italy, etc., before looking a little bit more closely at some of the individual clubs. And the presentation will finish with a short discussion around the future and some of the priorities for the different stakeholders in the game based on some of the information that comes out. If anybody is interested, the 4 papers where the data comes from are all listed on there. So if anybody wants some additional reading, particularly bedtime reading, probably send you to sleep, but you can have a look at any of those 4. And all the data that I'm about to present comes from these 4 different from different papers. So I want to start with just outlining the context and the history and the major changes in the English game since the Premier League began in 1992. Ordinarily, I'm not a big fan of the Sky Sports notion that football started in 1992, but given the nature and scale of change at this point, the history of the game in England, it was a start point for the data collection as well for the first paper. I thought I'd start the context from that point. The 2011-12 season was the 20th anniversary of the competition beginning, and that was a sample framework for paper number 1. So the breakup of the old First Division and subsequent creation of the English Premier League as a rebranded competition has probably been the biggest catalyst for change in the English game in the history of its operation. It resulted in significant increases in the levels of income being generated, in particular through TV rights and sponsorship, gate receipts, corporate hospitality, a whole range of different things. And the most recent TV deal at over £5 billion over 3 years is testament to that. In addition to that, the regulations have been introduced which affect player development and recruitment strategies have also changed significantly, starting with the Bosman rule in 1995, which really opened up the opportunities for player migration, and coming more recently, UEFA's homegrown rule, which was a significant intervention by the European governing body. And this piece of legislation was phased in over 3 seasons between 2006 and 2008. And it had a requirement in it that European clubs had to include players developed in their own national association for 3 years between the age of 15 and 21 in the matchday squad. There was a minimum number required. Unfortunately, the way that UEFA designed that legislation meant there were 2 critical flaws in it. The first one being there's no obligation to actually play the players as long as they were in the squad that was registered. That was absolutely fine. So there was no obligation on to actually put them in the team. The second flaw in the design of the legislation was that nationality was not a factor. So therefore, if you brought players in from different countries, as long as they had 3 seasons in your academy between the age of 15 and 21, they counted as homegrown. That wouldn't actually have much of an impact on developing players for your own national team. So the way that the regulation was developed was flawed in the way that it was designed. Some of the unintended consequences of that meant that some clubs started to stockpile players, also early recruitment of youth players from overseas, which went against the key principle of protecting playing opportunities of local players, which is what UEFA tried to design that regulation to do. Since that point, there have been some additional regulations in England, such as the Elite Player Performance Programme, the changes to the reserve leagues and under 21s, which extends under 23s, by getting rid of reserve team football, and some of the financial fair play regulations that have come in, which affect recruitment strategies, all of which are contributing variables within the complex field of developing elite footballers. So I just wanted to start the presentation results section with a historical tracker from the first season in which the Premier League played in 1992-93 up to 2014. So there are, this is 22 seasons rather than 20. I added a couple of data points on for a different presentation. And it tracks the proportion of appearances made by English players and those made by those overseas. And that doesn't include Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it's just England and overseas. And you can see clearly from the graph there's a quite striking downward trend in the proportion of appearances made by English players, to the point in 2001-2 where more appearances were made in the Premier League by players who were from overseas than there were from players who were English. Since that point, English players have accounted for between 30 and 40% of all appearances in the Premier League, which is a minority, obviously, and it's not particularly great for the development of players that can then go on and play for England. Since the homegrown rules have been brought in, so the black arrow to the right of the screen, there's not really been a great deal of change in terms of the number of English players or the appearances that they're making. So the early analysis of the efficacy of the UEFA's intervention suggests it's not really made a huge amount of difference in England. And following the initial analysis that we did in England, we extended this out into European football. So we looked at the 6 major European leagues, which are La Liga in Spain, the German Bundesliga, France's Ligue 1, the Eredivisie in the Netherlands, and Serie A in Italy. And added those 5 leagues on top of the Premier League as well. And we looked at extending the time frame from 1999. We brought it up to the turn of the millennium. And when you look at the playing statistics from European football since the turn of the millennium, the picture is very mixed from the different countries in terms of the opportunities that are afforded to players that qualify to play for the countries that host the leagues. So the next slide looks at the number of appearances made by players from each national association in one of those 6 major European leagues. And as you would expect, the top 6 are the league hosts, and they recorded the most appearances. But the volume really varies, with players who qualified to play for Spain and France recording almost twice the amount of those that qualified to play for England. So the difference is quite striking. Germany and Holland are also quite interesting because they operate 18 teams in their elite league rather than 20. So there are fewer fixtures. So even with fewer games played in their leagues, they're still creating a greater number of appearances from players from their own national association. And that difference between 18 team leagues and 20 team leagues is quite significant, because each season it means there are 74 fewer fixtures played. And over the sample period, it meant there were 1,184 fewer games played. Yet German footballers and Dutch footballers were still playing, making more appearances than England with a 20-team league. So the data isn't great for the opportunities available for English players to play. The Premier League is probably the weakest in terms of offering opportunities to its own national players. It's also important to highlight the role of migration across the different leagues as well, just to have a wider assessment of playing opportunities. And it's interesting to look at how the players from each of the host leagues migrate across the different ones as well. So the blue bars represent the number of appearances made by players in the league of their own nationality, and the red bars represent the appearances made in one of the other 5 main leagues. So for England, the data is not particularly great. Not only do they have the least amount of appearances in terms of the 6 hosts, very few of the English players in the sample time frame were actually migrating out to play in any of the other leagues as well. Only 792 appearances were made by English players in one of the other 5 elite leagues in the 16 seasons covered in this graph. So for the development of English players, the reluctance to migrate to other leagues also restricts the opportunities available. And although that's improved in more recent seasons, with young English players going into other European leagues, it's still not on the same scale as the migration patterns from some of the other countries. And it means that if you're restricting the opportunities in your own league and your players are not migrating, it creates a bit of a bottleneck really for the opportunities of how those players can go and get those elite level experiences. So we also wanted to look at the analysis on a league basis, but we actually wanted to look at the individual clubs within it as well, because we wanted to see whether or not specific approaches taken by different clubs within the system allowed us to compare different types of clubs or different approaches that some might take. So this was the third study. So we looked at categorizing clubs into their appearances in the 10 seasons that we looked at. So we had just basically to look at whether or not the different club types had an influence on the levels of opportunity they offered to homegrown players. And this is important as well to try and identify additional element of perceived quality of the playing experience. So are players coming through to play for those clubs who are chasing league titles, getting to cup finals, playing in European competitions, or are they being generated by clubs that are battling relegation or go up and down between the different leagues? So we looked at 4 categories. So those clubs that had played in all 10 seasons, those that have played in the majority of seasons between 6 and 9, the minority of seasons between 2 and 5, and those that had 1 season. And this allowed us to look at the different clubs and start to analyse their outputs in terms of player development. So this slide is basically looking at the top club in each national association in terms of the number of players they've produced and the number of players that then gone on to play for the club where they've developed. So they've got to be eligible to play for the national team of the league that they play in. So the table on the left shows the total number of players produced by the top performing club in each national association, and the one on the right is looking at the number of players who made an appearance in the club in which they developed. So England's top performing club, which is Manchester United at the bottom, and they produced the lowest number of players across all 6 leagues in terms of the best performing club. And Ajax Amsterdam actually produced 3 times the number of elite players than Manchester United, which is pretty striking given that Manchester United are the best performing club in that time frame for producing elite footballers. Interestingly, only 2 of the clubs on the left-hand side also appear on the right-hand side. So there are issues in terms of transition from players that make their debuts, players that come through to an academy and actually make their debut in that club, or whether or not they actually move out and play for a different club further down the league pyramid. So actually Feyenoord have given more debuts to academy graduates than any other team. So although Ajax produced more players, Feyenoord have produced more players that have gone on to play for their club. Athletic Club Bilbao are a really interesting club to be in there. From a cultural perspective, Bilbao are a club that are owned by their members. They've got an aim to ensure players are native to the Basque Country. Any profits they make are reinvested into the academy system, and they're underpinned by the philosophy of contere y afición no hace falta importación, which means with homegrown talent and local sport, you don't need imports. And the Basque region is part of my sort of family heritage as well, so it's quite nice to see them up there. So, it's important to look at the volume of opportunity being created rather than just the number of players, because the volume of playing opportunities gives a better indication of the quality of the opportunity, because you could produce a lot of players that play for 5 minutes at the end of the last game of the season. That doesn't have a great impact in terms of making an imprint on your club and having an impact on that. So we start to look at the volume of playing time being given by some of these players. So I want to just highlight some of those. So the first thing, this table is outlining the top 20 clubs in terms of minutes played by graduates from their academy system. And the notable points from this is that the first two clubs by some distance are both from the Netherlands, Ajax and Feyenoord, and they were on that previous slide. And they've also got a very healthy conversion rate of producing players that go on to play significant amounts of time for their club. The second club I wanted to know, again, going back to Athletic Club Bilbao, they're not producing the most number of players, but their conversion rate is really, really high. So 32 of their 44 academy graduates that have played elite level football have played for Bilbao and generated over 100,000 minutes for Bilbao in the elite league. So they've got a really strong production line that's very much culturally driven. The third one was a really, really big surprise to us when we did the analysis, was the presence of 5 of Europe's big heavyweight clubs. So Barcelona, Juventus, Bayern Munich, Real Madrid and Paris Saint-Germain. It was a big surprise to see clubs with significant resources on this list, developing players through their own academy structure. They've all got significant resources, and some of the clubs, in particular Real Madrid, have got an affinity to a high-profile signing or two. To see them actually appear in the top 20 in terms of their academy graduates coming through to play, and also recording a significant number of those playing for their club, is also an interesting finding when you compare that to some of the English clubs. Another one that stands out on the list is Sparta Rotterdam, who are playing the Dutch league. They're a Category 3 club, so it means for the sample time frame, they only actually spent 4 seasons in the Dutch top flight, but they have actually produced a lot of players. And this shows the importance of the important role that clubs from outside of the top flight have got in player development, either going to play for different clubs in the elite leagues or as clubs get promoted. So there are some really different types of clubs in this particular sample time frame. One thing that you'll notice as well across the top 20 is none of them are English. So none of the English Premier League clubs that have played in the period that we were looking at appeared in the top 20 in terms of minutes played by their academy graduates. They were all from the other 5 leagues. And if we flip that to the bottom end and we look at, from those clubs that have been ever present in those 10 seasons that we're looking at, and look at the worst 2 performing clubs in terms of producing players, it's striking to see that the 2 English ones are Manchester City and Chelsea. They're 2 clubs that have won titles, played the Champions League most seasons. And then when you look at their playing data on the right-hand side, the number of appearances that their academy graduates have played for those clubs is significantly lower than a lot of the other ones. And again, if we think about the quality of the appearance that the academy graduates are getting, Man City and Chelsea take up Champions League berths. They're not offering opportunities to play young English players. Then it really restricts the opportunity for some of those English lads to go and play in the elite competitions, and that can have a big impact on their development as players and the opportunities that they get to play. Atletico Madrid are highlighted as they're the second lowest in La Liga, but they've produced 32 players, which is only 1 short of Manchester United, who are England's best performing team. So when you start to look at the best performing ones in the English league, they're actually on a similar scale to the worst performing ones in some of the other leagues. So again, it doesn't particularly show the English clubs in a great light in terms of player development. The final part of the presentation is looking at the different structures that operate across Europe and the associated player development data which can be identified from it. And it's based on whether or not clubs are allowed to field a second team in their professional structure. So 4 of the 6 leagues that we've looked at allow second teams in their league pyramids: Germany, Netherlands, Spain and France, although there are restrictions on how high in the pyramid that those teams are allowed. England and Italy don't allow clubs to have a second team in the professional structure. Now, not every team has a B team, but some of the big, powerful clubs like Barcelona, Ajax, Real Madrid, Bayern Munich all do have B teams operating at some level in their national association structure. And it's been a really important pathway for quite a few of the players. So when you look at the different clubs in the sample, and the ones that have got B teams and the one that don't, 73 of the 200 clubs that are in the sample have got a B team in the professional structure, and 127 don't. So when you start to look at the figures that come out from it, we're looking at the total.
Steve, I think you've cut out. I don't know if anybody else has had the same issue.
Yeah, it's definitely stopped.
He's definitely gone, hasn't he?
Getting exciting.
Well, there we are. Steve, are you able to rejoin? You dropped out.
Back on.
Yeah, you're back in. Do you want to just jump straight back in where you were? Are you able to do that?
Sorry, I don't know what happened. My iPad just cut out then.
All adds to the drama. I'll let you carry on, Steve. Thanks.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. I've tested this a few times and that's never happened. So, yeah, the first point to note is that the 73 clubs with a second team have developed a similar number of players to the 127 that haven't got them. So their average is obviously higher. But the clubs that have got second teams are producing a disproportionate amount of players compared to those that don't. If you look at the number of appearances being made by players who've developed through a club with a second team, there's over 18,000 more league appearances made by those, and it averages more than double per club than those that do. Those that do have a B team compared to those that don't. The volume of minutes generated is also significant. So again, those 73 clubs with a second team, academy graduates from those clubs have generated more than 1.2 million more minutes in the elite leagues than players without. And also in terms of the players that are coming through certain clubs, they are much more likely to play for the club that they develop through. So it means that there's a reduction in the need to dip into the transfer market because they're producing players that are of a sufficient quality to go and play in the leagues that they're operating in. And the final thing to look at is the contribution to the national team, which is what a lot of the legislations are about in terms of producing players for the National Association. The 73 clubs that have got a second team have developed 147 players for their national team, which is only one fewer than the 127 clubs that don't have a second team. And the players that do play tend to play more for their national team, so 25 caps each for those senior players that have developed through that system. So I'm not for 1 minute advocating that the professional structure in England should be torn up and replaced by having Man City and Liverpool B teams. But the culture in a lot of the other countries doesn't seem to pit club versus country as much as it does in England. The professional structure in England really works club v country, and it's very different in a lot of the other European leagues. And the pathways that they come through is very, very different. So in terms of the concluding comments from the previous research, there's not, it's a long-term approach. There aren't any quick fixes. And trying to balance the different stakeholders in terms of foreign ownership, administrative priorities and finance is really difficult. And for it to happen in England, it would require a major culture change from the clubs, from the owners, from the managers, the players and the supporters. But whether or not it'll ever happen in the scale that it's happened in other countries is debatable. The efficacy of the rules that UEFA brought in are still being understood, but I'm not convinced that the impact of the Bosman rule has ever really been realised, and I think it's almost trying to close the stable door after the horse has bolted. And it's that idea about whether or not it can be club and country rather than club versus country. But questions remain around whether or not owners, fans and the media even want it to change, and whether or not they want the Premier League to be different. So, do the different stakeholders want anything to change? in terms of producing local lads, is it harder for them to come through the academy? And does a local identity in football matter? Does it matter to have local lads playing in your team? And whether or not there's any place for sentiment in the commercially driven era. So there's some of the research questions that might be interesting to look at in the future. But as an overview, England's significantly behind a lot of our European counterparts in terms of our player development. It's something that whether or not they'll ever address, I don't know. But thank you very much for listening. I'm more than happy to take a few questions. Whether or not I can answer them is a different matter, but please feel free to.
Great stuff. Thanks for that, Steve. Very, very interesting talk there. Have you got any questions for Steve off the bat? Yep, saw Robbie's hand first.
Oh, cheers, Marcus. Cheers, Steve. That was class. I was just wondering. Obviously, the Premier League, it doesn't produce homegrown players, as you've seen, and how much do you think there's so much money in the Premier League that owners and managers can just buy whoever they like for however much money they like, and instead of investing in the academy, and the other leagues actually have to focus on producing their own players because they can't afford to buy wholesale players in.
Yeah, definitely. The volume of revenue that some of the Premier League clubs have got have meant that they don't have to rely on developing their own players. It is very much a cultural thing. But for a lot of the English lads, they don't have to be the best in their academy. They've got to be better than some of the Brazilian, Argentinian, Uruguayan lads that are all been brought in at 16, 17 to become homegrown. So for them to transition into the first team, it's very, very difficult. But culturally, a lot of the English players don't go and play in the other European leagues. So the Premier League acts as a silo for a lot of them. So the restriction on the opportunities they've got is quite high. So it's very, very culturally different, the way that clubs are operated, the way that the fans that they want short-term fix, they want quick gains. We don't take the long-term approach that some of the other clubs, other countries do. And that's part of the problem, really. The stakeholders involved don't want it to be like that. They want the Premier League to be worldwide and global. They're not bothered if they produce young English players. But from the FA's point of view, they need a national team that's competitive. So the two things just don't align.
Yeah, definitely. Cheers, Steve.
Good stuff. Lee?
Yep, I've got one. Cheers, Steve. Thought that was really interesting. I've got one related to Brexit, and I think there's been some rumours around the potential that the non-homegrown quota will be cut to 13, which obviously could increase opportunities for young English players within the leagues. But do you not think this could potentially lead to a premium on those players, and then the bigger clubs just kind of widening that gap and taking any good potential players from, say, the Championship, or maybe even lower down, and filtering them through to the big teams that are already within the Premiership?
Yeah, definitely. There's already stockpiling. Chelsea are quite bad for it. The amount of loans that they have, they'll pick up a lot of young players. And they'll see which ones develop, and if they do, they'll play them. If they don't, they'll discard them. English players have always had a premium on their head in terms of price, and that won't change. But who knows? Brexit's a very complicated thing. Cheers for that question, Lee. But I honestly don't know what's going to happen with that and how that'll be interpreted. I'm sure they'll find a way of getting around it.
I think they have said it would take 3 years to introduce kind of the measures to make sure that it's done fairly across the board. But I just think, could Premier League see it as maybe devaluing their league if there's less of the kind of world's best players moving into the Premier League, for example?
Quite possibly. Again, if the wages are there, I'm sure the players will stay. But it just depends. It has got the opportunity to create more playing time for young English players, but if the academy is stocked full of players that aren't English and they're the next cab off the rank, it doesn't matter the nationality, they'll just be played. If they count as homegrown because they've been in the academy system long enough, then again, it won't make much of a difference.
Cool, cheers.
Okay, I think time for one last quick question from Richard there.
Thanks a lot. Steve, I know you've started asking a few questions about whether or not it really matters where the players originate from. Having been through the survey as a rabid Leeds United fan, I could only really think of Calvin Phillips, who was in our squad. But the more I went through the survey, I thought, you know what? I really don't care. I think people are generally interested in how their team does if you've got an affinity to a particular club. And I just wondered what the initial data was showing, if you'd looked at any of it.
Yeah, just to widen Richard's point, I've actually tried to answer some of the research questions I put up at the end by setting up a survey that asks fans whether or not they care. And the short answer is no, I haven't looked. I suspect that younger supporters of the bigger clubs will care less about having local lads in the team than maybe older supporters who are from the area that they're from. Maybe more interested in having local lads playing. But I think in England, I don't think people really care. I think they want the team to win. And the bits that I have looked at is more people are interested in seeing their club win something than England win the World Cup, which tells you the club versus country issue is there, and it's not so much club and country, which it is in some of the countries and the way that they operate their leagues.
I just thought very quickly whether or not a straw poll would answer that question here in terms of how interested are you in your club winning something rather than England. If people want to show of hands for the club, I'll first that one.
I'd probably say yeah.
Sorry, Rich, you just broke up. I didn't catch that.
There's a poll. I tell you what, actually, let's just
yeah, use the technology, Marcus.
Hang on. Oh no, it's taking me to web. I tell you what, no, that's going to take far too long to set up a poll. I thought which might actually be a quick thing to do. So actually, if just add on the chat, just type in quickly club or country to indicate your preference, and I'll try and tally those afterwards.
If anyone's interested in filling the survey in, it's on the SPARC Twitter account, so feel free to go on there, retweet it, fill it in, send it round. It'd be great, thank you.
We can send a link to the chat, Steve, too, now, if you like. Do that.
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay, well...
cheers, Robbie.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the input, guys. We'll round that one up there. So thanks very much, Steve. For your talk. That's really, really useful.